Welcome to the show, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Before we begin today's episode, I want to say thank you to our newest supporters, Christine, Benjamin, and Fenway. We truly appreciate your generosity. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, you can become a patron at patreon.com/paranormal mysteries. Or if you prefer to make a one-time donation, please visit buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. And as always, subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with your friends is one of the best ways to show your support, and we appreciate it. Now, let's get ready and start the show. Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, and thank you for being here. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. As most of you already know, I love the woods, and in many ways I think that love is due to the respect that I have for the forest and all of the unknown elements that are encompassed within. We like to think that we know what lies behind every tree or in every cave, but the amount of strange phenomena that are experienced within the woods seems to be evidence to the contrary. And because we all love a good eyewitness encounter, I've decided to share a handful of stories that I've come across that have to do with odd experiences in the wilderness, some of which fall in line with the missing 411 phenomena, but I'll let you be the judge. So without further ado, let's get to our first story. This first story comes from a user on Reddit. My name is Luke, and I'm about 20 years old. This story happened to me when I was 17. This experience still gives me the chills to this day. In May 2017, I found myself going out a lot more on my mountain bike. I was getting bored of cruising around the streets, so I wanted to go for a trail or woodland bike ride. I've never been to Lay Woods before, and personally, I don't think I'll be going alone again. After some research into a few different areas, Lay Woods seemed to be my best bet. Living only a couple of miles away, it was a nice bike ride. On arriving, it looked very peaceful, and I was almost in a dreamlike state by my first look at the place. For a woodland area in England, let alone Bristol, it was amazing. On going into the woods, I remembered seeing different colors at the start of each trail, signifying difficulty for bikers, and for length for walkers, so I decided to go down a colored trail to see how it was there. Finding it exciting, I decided to go down the harder trail, and now here's where it starts to get weird. I began having this weird sort of vision, looking around as if I'm being swallowed by the woodland. Everything felt like it was getting bigger and further away. I brushed it off, but it turns out I actually lost track of time. I got lost on the trail. Now bear in mind, I'm very observant and aware of my surroundings before this trail. I then came to a strange opening. I could go left in the rough direction of the way out, or right, deeper into the woods. Me being me, I decided to go deeper into the woods. I came to a weird little trail that just had dodgy written all over it, metaphorically speaking. I went against my gut feeling of turning back, and I went down there. I came to a point of which the trail continued, but it was getting dangerous, the trail being too bumpy for me to even walk down. I then turned back. But for a few minutes before turning back, I don't know why, but I was just standing there, staring down this trail. I felt like I was being watched from all angles, even though it would have been nearly impossible to have that many eyes surrounding me in that area. I never got nervous and began walking back up the hill, as I was too tired to ride at this point. Keep in mind, my bike tires are completely solid. No punctures, slow punctures, or even anything wrong at all. I wish I still had pictures of the bike. Upon getting back to the spot where I originally went to the trail, that weird loss of time thing happened. It felt as if the whole path had stretched by half a mile, as if the woodland was moving. I began walking up the path, feeling that same eerie sensation of being watched as I did beforehand. This time it felt a bit more sinister. It felt as if something was about to happen, bearing in mind I hadn't seen a single person at this point in time since I went down the first trail. I'll explain the scenery before continuing. It's a long path, a slight steep hill to my left, a very narrow river to my right, maybe 4 feet deep and maybe 4 feet wide. Bushes are on either side of the river, with the odd tree every now and then. Upon getting about 1/4 mile up the slowly inclining path, I hear a woman crying behind a tree up ahead. I start slowing down my pace to try and get a good look behind the tree, but the whole time I'm thinking to myself, why would someone jump across the creek to cry behind a tree? So I edge closer to the river to look behind to see if the person is okay. Also because many people go to Lay Woods to commit suicide, so I was hoping to maybe help this person. But you guessed it, there was no one there, and the crying stopped. A bit weirded out, I just slowly turned away and started walking again, a bit quicker, as I was unnerved at the time. I've had paranormal experiences before, but not usually in a place like the woods, usually in a house or some sort of building, so this was new to me. I had this sudden shiver as I was walking, and maybe a minute or so later, only a couple of meters away from where I had heard the crying, it started again, but this time it was right opposite me across the river. I didn't bother looking. I started to go into a bit of a jog, and as I got faster, I heard the bushes rustling, as if they, or it, was following me. Upon hearing this, I sped up, and the crying became more and more hysterical. Bear in mind, my bike was fine before this moment in time. I went to hop on my bike with the adrenaline that was rushing through me, and I came to an almost sudden stop. My back tire on my bike had become completely flat, so I had no other choice but to sprint with my bike and pray for the best that I don't trip up or end up having to throw it to run faster. With this crying person still close to me and keeping up, I'm running faster and faster, praying I just get off this path that I was on. I had that feeling of wanting to cry because I couldn't actually do anything to help the situation or get out of it faster. And after what felt like an hour, but in reality was probably only 5 or 10 minutes, I could see the car park. The crying had stopped following me and getting closer, and started moving back down to where I first had heard it. I must have been as white as a sheet of paper and hysterical with my breathing and wheezing as multiple people in the car park turned to look at me like I was crazy. I saw the exit sign out of the car park and ran towards it, and while doing so, I noticed my bike to be moving a lot smoother on approaching the car park exit. I couldn't believe it. My bike tire had suddenly regained all of its air. It was solid again, as it was before the unnerving crying person shenanigans. I jumped on my bike and got away from Lay Woods as fast as I could, and have never gone back since, as every person I tell this story to becomes reluctant to go there with me, or any extra people. The thing that makes this scary is I have Irish heritage. In Irish folklore, there is a demon called the Banshee. She is seen in woodlands next to rivers and lakes, washing blood off of clothes. Alternatively, if you hear her crying, it means death. I can't remember the meanings exactly of the deaths, but it means either you or a loved one will die. Since 2017, I have lost my auntie, 2 of my best friends, and a dog. This next story comes from a Reddit user by the name of Kohaku's Mom, and this is their story. The user says, "I'm not sure if I'm in the right place, but I've held this story in for the last 6 years because it sounds crazy, and I got told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere. Absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car. went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back, and had dinner. It was all very normal, until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler and a stereo that we brought in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent, away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning and I felt fine. I had slept hard, and from inside the tent, everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown, and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces, laying next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off now. It was quiet, and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about the woods felt wrong. My ex accused me of not locking the car that night before, and that an animal got in our stuff. I promised that I had, and went into the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground, right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that he had had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent, holding his gun, and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it, and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. This next experience comes from a Reddit user called Cosplay REI. The user says, I'm a 17-year-old female who recently found out about this subreddit. I'm not new to Reddit or anything paranormal or cryptic. I mostly joined because I grew up watching Ghost Adventures, or fact or fiction, paranormal files, and it just goes to show you that I have always been aware and interested in this stuff. But after reading others' experiences, I figured I would share some of my own in hopes of getting any advice or answers as to what could be messing with me. I live in Florida and have always been aware of many Native American cultures, even though I am not of that heritage myself. So I timelined and tried to write down everything I remembered about these experiences to give me a guide when writing this out. It started from when I was very young, and the first instance of this happening was when I was living with my grandmother. Her and I were very close. This will play in later. I was wide awake in bed, unable to sleep, with her to my right. There's no doubt in my mind that she was deeply asleep, only a few inches from me. Every television in the house was off, and the only other person in the house was my grandfather, asleep in his room. Then, very clearly and loudly, I hear my grandmother call me from the kitchen, almost how you'd be called for dinner. I know it's common to hear your name being called mistakenly, but I did more research on this as a teen, and apparently when you hear your name being called this aloud, you're supposed to reject it, but I did not. Not knowing this, I just huddled closer to my grandmother and kept my eyes locked on the open door. The second instance was when I was around 13 or 14, when my father took me on a family trip to Las Vegas. We visited some part of the Grand Canyon, and while my family was waiting in line for a skywalk bridge we had paid a tour for, I wandered around the edge a good distance away from my family and decided to yell my name into the canyon to hear my echo. When it came back to me, it sounded distorted and almost like my grandmother had yelled my name back. It might not have been my grandmother exactly, but it was very similar. Nevertheless, just the fact that it was distorted was enough to scare me a little. I don't put much weight into this experience because it might have just been my voice being thrown weird. This next one happened when I was 13 or 14 as well. It's the most terrifying one that I've had, and every time I tell this story to people, I start to cry or tear up. This is the closest I've ever been to whatever this is, and proves my point that it's mimicking people I care about. I was on vacation with my family in Key West and had rented a home. I invited my best friend, who we will call Ash, to stay with us. On the third day, we decided to skip out on the boating trip and mooch off of the house owner's Netflix all day. On about the 5th episode of what we were watching, we decided on a snack refill and a bathroom break. We paused the television, and I made my way to the kitchen. I thought that Ash had followed me into the kitchen and leaned on the island while I prepared some chips with my back turned to her. I held a full conversation with whatever this thing was, and I even looked back at her on the phone. I fully had no doubt in my mind that I was talking and looking at Ash on her phone. She even held it the same specific way that Ash does. I turned my back for a split second to pick up the bowls and suggest that we head back to the couch when I see Ash, or the real Ash anyway, walk out of the bathroom, which was a solid 30 feet away. My body immediately went cold, and the first thing I asked her was how she got to the bathroom and in and out without me hearing. She then gave me the weirdest look and told me that she's been in there the whole time since we got up. This is where I started freaking out and insisted that I had just been talking with her and even physically saw her. She joked about doppelgangers and how maybe she was going to die. I quickly suggested that we get out of the house and walk around the neighborhood. We walked around the neighborhood until my mom called me and said that she was back in the house. We are still best friends to this day, and have been for 11 years, and I asked her about it today before I wrote this. She said she didn't hear me talking with anybody at all. Now at this point, you guys might think I'm crazy, but for this next one, I have a witness. I felt a little less crazy after it happened with people who freaked out as much as I did. Again, I was on vacation near the Great Smoky Mountains, but just a little west in Sevierville, Tennessee. We had our previous reservations canceled, so we took this little rundown cabin owned by a local woman. Now, we got there late at night, and the moment we all stepped out of the car, the first thing we heard was a man's voice saying, "Hey neighbors," coming from a cabin to the left of ours that was higher up on the mountain that we were on. We couldn't see the cabin really, just a road that led further up, so we assumed he could see us, but we couldn't see him. Probably some guy on his balcony. My friendly stepdad just yelled, "Hey!" and we waved up towards the direction it came from. It wouldn't have been weird if this didn't happen every time we stepped out of the cabin or car. My family completely wrote it off as some type of hospitality we were not used to in Miami. Retelling it, my brother and my friends agreed it was weird. I did hear constant footsteps around the cabin at night, and some outside my window. It was a raised cabin, probably a story or two off the ground, but I don't give it much thought since wildlife is a thing in the woods. Just something I thought that I should mention maybe. The thing that really propelled me into researching the heck out of what was happening to me was when I was having a photo shoot in the woods behind the cabin, and both my brother, sister, and I heard something calling my name deeper into the woods. Since I was with my younger siblings, I went into full big sister protection mode and almost threw them back down the little slope we had climbed to get into the woods. We were all scared by how clear the sound was and how we all pinpointed that it was coming from the deeper woods and nowhere near the cabin. This was during the day, and we were all so thrown by this that we stayed in for the rest of our trip. We all agreed it was a woman's voice, and the first thing I asked my mom when we got inside was, "Did you call me?" She had been lounging in her room with my stepdad all day, trusting that I could take care of the younger ones, just outside the cabin. She saw how freaked out the kids were, and we didn't really go out at night for the rest of our trip. I think I reacted badly to this one, mostly because I had kids to take care of, and I could tell that they were terrified out there. Again, the voice sounded like someone was looking for me, or calling me back somewhere. This next story comes from Reddit user Winter3377. They say, "I'm not going to provide any exact locations for this, as this happened on the trail that my mom and I walked the dog on every day for 10 years. As such, it was pretty close to our house, etc. I lived in a rural part of the PNW, or Pacific Northwest. and so there were a lot of trails just outside town that bordered on a lot of forest. This was one of those, but it was probably the biggest trail in my town. It was actually an access road to some stuff, so it was like 10 feet wide and gravel. At the time, I briefly went missing. I was about 10 years old and had walked that trail every single day for 3 to 4 years. My mom was with me, as was our dog, an 85-pound Rottweiler Lab Aussie mix. I'd been warned not to go off the trail and wouldn't have normally, but there was a small sub-trail that had a rope swing over a creek. I loved to play there as a kid, and that day I crossed the creek via a fallen tree bridge to hang out on the other side while Mom talked to a friend that she'd ran into. I was within sight of my mom, clear view across the creek, when all of a sudden it was like things swirled. My surroundings were completely unfamiliar, and there were plants that shouldn't have been there. The wrong kind of trees, with the leaves at slightly the wrong point for the season. Of course, I knew what to do if I got lost. I hugged a tree and shouted for Mom. I was probably 300 yards away at absolute most, probably more like 100 yards. She should have heard me, but she didn't. I wasn't there for very long before our dog came and got me. He wasn't a very smart dog. With all love, saying he was as dumb as a bag of rocks would have been an insult to rocks. He also didn't like me nearly as much as he liked Mom. He was a total mama's boy, and would have stayed near her, but he calmly walked up to me, nuzzled my hand so it was on his head, and walked me back out to the creek, where I could see my mom. I thought that I'd only been gone for 15 minutes or so. Apparently, it was an hour or more, and multiple people were looking for me, including people that were walking directly on the path that I had never left. This next account comes from a Reddit user called Sowhat. Sowhat says, I have experienced something this week truly phenomenal that I cannot explain. Something so earth-shattering and reality-breaking that I am still in shock. Adrenaline is still pumping through my system even now, writing this 4 days later. Last Monday, August 17th, I went camping alone in the Uwharrie National Forest. My goal was to de-stress and simply enjoy nature. I brought along a knife, some MREs, which are packs of freeze-dried food essentially, a tarp, and rope to construct a shelter. I arrived at the campground around 2. I began to hike. It is deathly quiet. The only wildlife I encounter are 2 deer at the beginning of the trail. They squeal and run away. As I'm hiking, I notice a large amount of quartz deposits strewn about, enough to raise an eyebrow. I reach a valley clearing about 10 miles in, and it was between 2 streams. I constructed my shelter in the center. Old campfires littered about told me that this place must be a good place to camp. After finishing my tarp tent, I began to walk around and explore the area. I heard thunder and decided to head back to my shelter. Here's where things start to get strange. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it still. I lay on my stomach in my tent. As the storm rolls in, I feel a strange pressure change. Low base frequency and temperature drop. Not that odd considering I'm in a valley. As it approaches, however, I feel a sensation I have never felt before. I can feel the storm above me in a way that I can't fully describe. The best I can do to detail this feeling is to say that my consciousness was aware and expanded enough to feel this mass above me. I'm thinking that this is very weird, but don't entertain any thoughts of this possibly being paranormal. That is until I hear the first sound. I hear a loud whoop. I'd guess a quarter of a mile away. The hairs stand up all over, and then it begins to pour rain very hard. At this point, I have no earthly idea what could have made that sound, other than a very large animal that I'm unfamiliar with. Time passes. I'm still laying in my tent. Not quite dark, but it's raining, so I have nothing to do but scan the trees and listen. That's when I see the light. A very small, what looked like a coin reflecting in the sun, only there was no sun, and it was moving. It blinked on and then off, quickly, then reappeared a few feet to the side, and then off again. I never saw it again. Not soon after, I began to hear what in my mind were bipedal footsteps. They didn't seem like they came from a large animal, but I never saw what made them. They began in the exact same spot that I witnessed the light a few minutes prior. I am staring intently at this spot, frozen in fear, clutching my knife, unable to move. It's silent until dusk. It's still raining. And then I hear the second whoop, much closer and louder, on the other side of my shelter. Whatever made this noise was maybe now 50 feet away. Night falls and adrenaline is pumping through me. I lay on my back. It is so dark it did not matter if my eyes were open or closed. There was no noise for a few hours, and I began to relax slightly. That is, until I heard the babbling. I had set up between two streams, so my rational brain was making me think that it was just the water, but it was not. If I had allowed myself to believe that I was actually hearing some sort of inhuman speech that far into the woods all alone, I would have panicked or blacked out with fear perhaps. I hear this intermittently throughout the night, in two places. It's soft, as if they were whispering to one another about me, not wanting to wake me up. I lose consciousness at some point, but awake to something being thrown at my tent. A small rock. Nothing more of note happens that I'm aware of until morning, where I get the hell out of there. I arrive home and immediately begin researching what could have possibly been making those noises. I look at deer, mountain lions, bears, even raccoons and squirrel noises. Nothing comes close. That is until I decide to entertain the Sasquatch theory, and I came across the Sierra sounds. It is exactly the same. I cannot tell you how frightened I was when I heard this video. It is the same exact noise. I can't even begin to process this. Even still, I'm shaking typing all of this out for you. The murmuring, that's the worst part. They were talking to each other. This next experience comes from a Reddit user by the name of DapperCheezel1, and they have this to say. About 12 years ago, I was home for a weekend, and my family decided to go to our cabin. This was an A-frame style house, about 100 feet from a lake in the middle of the woods. Although we had neighbors, none of them usually visited on non-holidays, and this was no exception. I would always sleep on the couch, so my sister and parents would get a bed. The thing that always freaked me out was that the couch was right next to the opening A of the A-frame, which was glass from floor to ceiling, and about 25 feet high. Not only that, but right outside was a second-story deck, which had stairs up to it, and a sliding glass door to get in. At the time, we had 3 dogs who would go ape if anything was on the deck. We normally had possums or raccoons scavenging up there, so it wasn't uncommon to wake up in the middle of the night with them barking into the darkness of the sliding glass door that was a foot from me. One of the nights, things got strange. I am usually up fairly late, so it must have been around 2 a.m., and I'd finally started to try to wind down. Before I shut my eyes, something comes into view that looks like a light source at around person level on our deck, close to the edge of where the stairs come up. I freak the hell out, but stay still. It looked like a person holding something that was the color of a glow stick, but round. I slowly reach and grab my glasses, so I can take action if needed. My phone is charging right by the glass door leading outside, and if I pulled it off the charger, it would light up, so I can't grab it. The light source is now about 10 feet away from me, and I still can't really tell what it is. However, it's still glowing green and at person height. I'm fairly knowledgeable on wildlife, and instantly try to justify it in my head as a large lightning bug. The problem is, it's about the size of a baseball from the angle I'm at, and not blinking. Lightning bugs can have a defect that makes them light up without blinking, but it's rare, so it could only be a person snooping outside our deck, potentially trying to break in, or worse. What bothered me was that the dogs were not going ballistic like they normally do. There's 3 of them, so one of them would always notice if anything was amiss and alert the others. Here's where it gets even more unexplainable. The light source starts getting closer. As it gets closer, it's not the size of a baseball like I originally thought, but more like the size of a large grapefruit or cantaloupe. It gets extremely close to the window, about an inch or two. Now I still get the chills as I type this because my mind wanted to picture a person putting their face up to the window with the green glow illuminating it, but it never happened. Instead, this large glowing green orb starts hovering around and slowly begins moving up against the glass towards the top of the A-frame. I watch this thing float steadily up until it goes out of view. The whole way up, it didn't touch the window the way an insect normally would, which confused me. This entire interaction was completely silent. My main theories are that this is either a type of large unknown bioluminescent insect that is only above ground every number of years, or some weird lightning bug anomaly that's never been documented, or potentially even ball lightning, or maybe something I haven't been able to find via research. I will also note that the windows were not foggy, and I do not, nor have I ever had night terrors, or done any hallucinogens or drugs that would cause visual manifestations like this. I was completely lucid during this time. I think about this story quite a bit, and finally decided to actually put it into writing to see if anyone else has had similar experiences. Also from user DapperCheezel1 comes this next story. They say, reading through all of these posts sparked my memory of a hike with my other half in the beautiful mountains of Banff, near Calgary. We were up alone on the side of a spring avalanche zone that was done with snowfall for the season. All of a sudden I get a powerful, bizarre gut feeling of fear. As soon as it hit, everything around us fell completely silent. There are always birds, squirrels, marmots, etc., chirping in the mountain passes, and I mean always. You can feel the life around you, and we had up until that point. Everything just stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling, and I asked my girlfriend if she felt strange. She replied that she was terrified for the same reason. The oddest part is that we are avid hikers. Going 13 miles out into the wilderness is not out of the ordinary for us. We've also hiked all over the world, and neither of us have ever felt this type of irrational terror or emotion before. It was almost indescribable, but felt like an iso chamber was dropped around us. It was both mental and physical in change, almost like walking through a portal. Not even the wind was blowing. We scrambled out of that area as quickly as we could, almost doubling our pace, not running, just in case it was a mountain lion or bear. After a few minutes, everything went back to normal, and the rest of the hike was fine. We came back the same way, and didn't have the same feeling, and the normal sound of nature was around us. This next report comes from a user by the name of Tully Road. This is their experience. I have been tempted to share this story for a while now. The following occurred on an island off Washington State about 7 years ago. My sister and her family moved from Oregon to Washington. I tagged along to check it out. It was different there. The woods in Oregon had a welcoming fantasy forest feeling, whereas the woods of Washington felt ominous, forbidding, especially at night. You could really feel the woods out there, if that makes any sense. It was late afternoon. I was just chilling on the sofa at my sister's new place when she says she's found out about a trail on the island. It was already late afternoon, but we said, what the hell, let's go check it out. Her husband wasn't up for it, but he agreed to drop us off and pick us up after. My oldest niece also decided to go with us. It's about 15 minutes away, so we grab a handful of things, and off we went. We were walking and talking, enjoying the quiet. It was a simple trail, nothing special so far. We get to this enormous tree that must have been 6 feet around. It's in the middle of where the trail splits off in two directions, one that leads toward the seashore, and one that leads further into the woods. So we head towards the sea. We hang there for a bit, taking in the view and shooting the breeze before we start to head back. We get back to the big tree, and we decide to go check out the other trail, leading off into the woods. We're having a nice time. We have the trail entirely to ourselves, and we're laughing and kidding around, enjoying each other's company and this nice day. I don't remember who brought it up, but somehow Bigfoot comes up. Jokingly, I pick up a big stick and start whacking it against a random tree on the side of the trail. Instantly, About 20 yards off the trail, before I'm even done with my second tap, a very loud wood-rapping sound begins hammering a tree very fast. And when I say fast, I mean death metal blast beat fast, and incredibly loud. We can't see anything there though, and then suddenly it stops. We stand there, startled. I think my niece said something about a woodpecker, and we all agreed, and moved on. From here on, you might say I'm making too much out of nothing, or that we were idiots, but you had to be there. You know the whole, the woods went silent thing? Well, they were already quiet, but something had shifted. The atmosphere had changed, and we weren't laughing now. We were uneasy, but we kept going, and slowly started relaxing and chatting. Then from somewhere up above us, between the treetops and sky, a monkey started screaming. We froze. Everyone knows that sound. It's unmistakable. Rising higher and higher, like laughter moving closer and closer, and as it passes above us, it seamlessly morphs into a crow cawing. But although we followed the sound as it passed overhead, we didn't see anything. We keep moving. No one says anything, but we silently agree to move back towards the exit. We finish the loop we were on and head back in the direction of the big tree. Instead, we end up on a part we don't recognize. We spend the next hour or so backtracking and pretending there isn't a seed of panic in our guts. It's getting darker and the temperature is dropping. We focus on the situation and we try to keep our cool. Finally, up ahead we see the big tree and we are all relieved. As we are headed towards the tree, we hear children. You know, the sound of a big group of kids bursting out of the school doors, laughing. Kind of like that, heading towards the seashore. I was relieved to hear people. We rounded the big tree and started heading back up the main trail towards the exit. My sister calls her husband and tells him to go ahead and come to get us. Up ahead of us is a bend, and from around the bend comes two dogs. One big guy and one little guy, dragging leashes. They stand there just looking at us, and as we approach the bend, they both turn around and go back. About 20 seconds later, we round that bend, expecting to greet the owners, and there is nothing there. No dogs, no people. It's a straight shot up to the exit from there. The sides of the trail are about 8 feet high and steep. There is nowhere anyone could have gone. That's when I remember the kids. It's getting dark soon. Where are they? Why would a crowd of kids be going to a random isolated seashore at this time of day? Then it occurs to me that we didn't hear any footsteps. A crowd of kids would have made much more noise, especially moving at that speed. Also, there were no footsteps of anyone but us. Her husband has by then shown up and is waiting with the engine running. Right before we exit the gate, a powerful stench of something dead and rotting hits me. I glance up to my left in the direction it's coming from, and I feel a force of pure malevolence shooting right at me, like nothing I have ever felt in my life. Absolute and passionate hatred aimed directly at me. My nose and my eyes are glued to the spot, but there is nothing there. We get in the car and pull away, and that is the part that bothers me the most, because none of us said a thing. As soon as we shut the doors, it was like it never happened. We started talking about dinner and watching a movie, etc., like nothing had happened. It wasn't till later that night, alone looking at some snapshots I had taken of the hike, that I started to piece it together. On a whim, I messaged my friend Joe, who is into weird stuff, and I tell him a short version of the events. He never replied, and I forgot about it. Over a few years and several phones, I've never deleted that message. It was like a blank spot sat where my memory of it should be. I could only remember it clearly when I reread it. Another strange thing is that both my sister and I are into Bigfoot and the missing 411, yet we never once discussed it. I brought it up once a couple years ago, something like, "Do you remember that weird trail we were on?" Her reply was, "I'll never go back to that trail again." And that was that. It never came up ever again. Hearing a monkey scream in that forest was the most scared I've ever been in my entire adult life. What sticks with me the most, however, was the hatred I can't describe, just emanating like that stench accompanying it. Just absolute and total hatred directed right at me. Not my sister, not my niece. whatever it was wanted me to know that it was me that it despised completely. That it would have been there at the finish line, no matter what. These stories represent a very small cross-section of what's being experienced in forests around the world. And if you've seen or heard anything bizarre in the wilderness, no matter how odd it may be, I want to hear from you. If you've witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great beginning to your week, and we'll see you back here on Wednesday with our next episode. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, thank you for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.